Right. Let's see. It says we are live, and yes, we are. So, good evening, everyone, and welcome back to the Emerging Revolutionary War, our Rev War Revelry. Welcome to the month of March. We are experiencing spring weather down here in Maryland, so it's nice 70 degrees. With tonight, we have Dan Welch of the Emerging Revolutionary War, Emerging Civil War, coming from the great Northwest Ordnance Territory state of Ohio. And tonight, we're going to discuss one of the interesting fallout of the Saratoga campaign, the Convention Army. We don't hear that term too often with surrendered armies. And so tonight is a discussion of who these men were, what happened, how they kind of were in limbo, and eventually how they took a tour of the pretty much half the American colonies by the time they were actually shipped back to Great Britain or into the German principalities. So we'll have a discussion today. We're glad you're with us. If you have any questions, of course, put them in the comments itself. But I'll kick it over to Dan for the opening remarks here on what is the Convention Army, or Saratoga. We'll start off big 50,000 foot view.
Yeah, this is one of these interesting stories in the American Revolution that is not really told, particularly in the historiography. There's some hints here and there. There's some smaller works that have been done on the Convention Army, but what an odyssey of a story that spans more than 6 years of the American Revolution with this Convention Army. And so what is a Convention Army? Where does the story begin? As you noted, Phil, that this all comes about in the wake of the Saratoga campaign. It's the fall of 1777, October of 1777. And there's a large force, British force, comprising not only British but German soldiers as well, that are going to surrender to American forces under the command of Gates in October 1777. This is following the second battle of Freeman's Farm in that month of 1777. But basically, what happens is when Burgoyne surrenders the troops or begins to negotiate with Gates, realizing that Burgoyne does not have a position in which he's going to be able to break free, that he's virtually surrounded by Gates. Gates's forces outnumber him nearly 2-1. Burgoyne and Gates start talking about how to reach that point of surrender or capitulation. And so what Burgoyne does is he bounds his army in what's known as a convention for the victorious Gates. And so that's why they're referred to as the Convention Army. But basically what happens is they dictate these terms, they go back and forth, and the terms of the convention is in regards to sending Burgoyne's men back to Europe under assurance that they would never again fight in North America during the remainder of the war. The problem is that Gates negotiates this with Burgoyne before sending the outcome, if you will, or even the notion that he's doing this to Congress. And Congress looks at what Gates has negotiated and says, wait a minute, we cannot follow the orders of this convention. We can't carry it out. The situation of the fight for independence in the fall of 1777 is by no means guaranteed toward the Americans. This is a sizable force of thousands of soldiers from Britain and from Germany. There's even some Canadian forces that have joined up with Burgoyne's men. So Congress is not going to allow this situation to play out, for the convention to be honored. So what Congress is going to do is they're going to do a lot of tap dancing over the next 6 years and basically shunt these troops from one place to the next throughout the colonies. By the end of it, one historian puts into effect that this army will have basically been prisoners, if you will, in 11 of the 13 colonies by 1783. So, really that 50,000 foot view Burgoynes Army has, if you will, surrendered to Gates's army following the Saratoga campaign in October of 1777. In order to avoid an official surrender, Burgoyne will bound his forces in a convention with Gates, and now Congress is going to have to deal with the fallout of this deal that Gates has made with Burgoyne.
And Burgoyne is obviously very sensitive to the wording of this as well. If you're looking at the view, what's interesting is the pulling of some of his officers and leading up to the capitulation. We also know a little bit about the dealings, and sometimes with James Wilkinson, who was one of the most colorful characters that will emerge from the American Revolution, and obviously will have a fall from fame, so to speak, later on. He's a long-serving, and he's here, though he is kind of the go-between. But there are some articles of this convention. Of course, necessary things: the arms and artillery will be given up. The troops will be withdrawn through Boston back to Europe. Of course, you have, not only do you have British soldiers, Burgoyne actually tries to delay a few days to allow some of his Canadian, the militia and so forth, to sneak out, to get back up to Canada, up through the Hudson. And of course, after he finds word that the other pincer movement with Barry St. Leger, who comes down the Mohawk Valley, he's stopped at what is now Fort Stanwix. And of course, there is also the 50,000-foot view, is you've got basically three major players too in the British forces, or British military hierarchy. You have William Howe is circling around. You've got John Burgoyne, Sir Henry Clayton, who's trying to come up the Hudson, and all being directed by George Germain from 3,000 miles away. And then you have a guy, Sir Guy Carleton, sitting in Canada, who's pretty much going, I'm out. So once you cross over out of New York, he's frustrated with Germain, and he's having his own. So you've got all this political infighting. What happens is about 5,990 soldiers, and German plus British, and those Germans come from either the German word, hopefully I don't mispronounce it, is Braunschweiger. We call it Brunswick, Hesse, Hanau. They're under a guy named Frederick Riedesel, who would stay with the troops. Burgoyne actually will go with the troops back to Boston, where he gets more elbow room, as they say, because he needed, that's a comparison back to in Boston prior to the Bunker Hill or Breeds Hill engagement. And then the second command is really William Phillips, who will die in Petersburg, Virginia, prior to Cornwallis's forces arriving in 1781. But Phillips is really the one that does stay with the convention army. But some of these articles as well, that the provisions to be supplied on the same scale as issued to the American army. I'm sure the British regretted that article being in there, because how the American army is lack of supplied throughout it. There's also no baggage will be searched by the Americans on assurance that no public stores are contained therein. Officers and men must not be separated as far as circumstances permit. And the treaty does cover everyone, not only just the army, but the camp followers as well. Canadians are going to be allowed to return to Canada, and officers to be admitted parole and their sidearms, and clothing and baggage from Canada could be transmitted or allowed for transit. And so, is it really a capitulation at all? I mean, basically it's, we'll give up the army and then move it in. And so you can see why Continental Congress, and especially some of the more radicals, think that this isn't really a capitulation or convention at all. We always get stuck with the main sticking point is, of course, these men will be sent back to England or Great Britain or to the German principalities until they're exchanged. But there's no stipulation that they can't just move troops from those home countries back into the colonies to replenish. And so what happens is kind of an overstepping from Gates. But he thinks that, of course, he does not know what's coming up, supposedly coming up behind him, that the thrust up the Hudson by Clinton.
Yeah, and that's a huge factor. I think in a lot of the historiography, the secondary sources out there, Gates really gets a bad rap for making this really broad capitulation, if you will. The terms of the convention really allow such a huge amount of leeway. But I think Gates was really up against a rock and a hard place. Yeah, he outnumbers Burgoyne's forces. He could attack Burgoyne and force some sort of more defined surrender, if you will. But the attack is going to most likely be a frontal assault. It'll be costly to the Americans to do so. And, Gates is getting pretty close to real-time intelligence that Clinton's pushing up the Hudson, and he's got another force coming into his rear. And so, in that situation, Gates is thinking, my God, I'm going to be stuck here. We would call it military strategy in this pincer movement. I'm going to be squeezed between Clinton and Burgoyne. I've got to do something with Burgoyne's forces. I've got to get them off the chessboard before I've got to turn my army around and face this threat. I think what Gates struggles with is twofold. Number one is selling this as a big victory throughout the colonial presses and in the Continental Congress. And I think really early on in the story too, where Gates stumbles is really the political side of things. It's 2 weeks after that this convention has been hammered out between Burgoyne and Gates before Gates sends anybody to the Continental Congress. It's not until October 31st that Gates' official representative arrives to the Continental Congress, which is in York, Pennsylvania at the time, due to the circumstances going on in New Jersey and eastern Pennsylvania and Philadelphia. So, Gates has got a problem selling it. Where is this big victory? This is a very, very very broad conventional terms, and being slow to really inform Congress of what he has hammered out with Burgoyne. So I completely agree with you in that fact, Phil, that this is a tough place for Gates, but I think he gets overly shamed, if you will, in the historiography. He's truly in a tough spot in October of 1777.
You're exactly right. And just following some of the chat here as well, we actually have a gentleman listening that is related to General James Wilkinson. So that's awesome. Pretty cool. We also have a person here who's related to General George Clinton, who actually not to be confused with the British general there. George Clinton actually would become governor, and actually one time governor and lieutenant governor. He's voted in as both of New York, and actually does a lot to help Washington's army. But not only is the Continental Congress left, but Washington actually receives this secondhand as well. The major victory, I think, actually comes, it's Putnam that actually relays the message saying, hey, I've received this, passing it along as well. Some of that, of course, is Wilkinson coming south. He decides to hang out and have a night of drinking and revelry, similar. Maybe he would have fit in with us, drinking and revelry. I think, and with a staff officer of Lord Stirling. And then he, of course, will pass on some other news that is outside of discussion of this. What also, so the big horse news is that the Continental Congress is going to renege on the other thing, but there's also other clauses of this that the Americans kind of are confused or kind of skeptical at. You have about over 5,000, around 4,900 infantrymen that surrender, and the Americans take possession of 648 cartouche boxes. So something just doesn't add up there to the Americans. Yeah. And so there are some of those, but meanwhile, that is what's happening, the political intrigue. Of course, the Americans adeptly moving the political side of it, tying some of these to, okay, we will release these prisoners or convention army as soon as we get some recognition from the British government, and of course recognize the rebellion colonies, which is something that Lord North's administration is never going to do, because that is paramount to something that these guys are legit and not a rebellion. But as they march in, of course, growing up with a father who was a military history buff reader, he always talked about the one lady screaming out to John Burgoyne, I bet you have enough elbow room now. So I don't know if that's the same as the proverbial Barbara Fritchie story or whatever, waving the flag in Frederick. I had to mention that because I am sitting in Frederick, Maryland. So But so they get in, and ironically, the British and German soldiers will actually march into Cambridge, and where they will be housed in the barracks that were hastily put up to provide shelter for another army about 2 years earlier, the American Army in 1775. They're actually commanded on the way in. One of the brigades that goes in is a guy who's very familiar, especially if you followed us back in December. I think maybe the last time Dan Welch was one of the revelries was the watch party. John Glover, his Massachusetts brigade. That guy seems to be everywhere. They help lead the Commission Army.
Him and Joseph Plum Martin, the Forrest Gumps of the American Revolution. Yeah.
There you go. So they head in, and of course, the other commander who's played a major part initially in the war, and some of these guys, they take other theaters. That's William Heath is actually commander in Boston at that time as well, and their goal, of course, is to try to keep this army intact. And at the same time, what is amazing is that the amount of I don't want to say confusion, but the ambiguity of what these soldiers are supposed to do. Now they are in prison. They're waiting to be exchanged. The company commanders, the line officers are trying to keep them, in one place, while John Burgoyne will actually take sail eventually back to England to plead his case. But at the same time, there is the fear that maybe a British strike will come up from, say, Rhode Island or from New York City to get them. At the same time, you have some of these soldiers start to walk out and try to provide some type of income. Conditions are very, very bad in Boston for the amount of soldiers that are there. So I don't know if you have anything to add about this part of it, Dan, but I'll give you.
Yeah, I think this period of late October through the change into January of 1778 is just a lot of people just do not know what to do. And in particular, the Continental Congress is realizing that this is something that they cannot hold up, that this is something that is not good for the American cause at this point in the war. Washington is upset by the convention. There are many congressmen in York, Pennsylvania, that are speaking out against the terms of it. But how are we going to, for lack of a better word, how are we going to get out of this? How is the American government and the American military going to get out of this situation without outright and blatantly violating this convention that Gates and Burgoyne have negotiated? And so there's a lot of people, kind of feeling around for what to do. Not only Glover and his charge with all these men up there, not only with, Continental Congress and York, but Gates, trying to maintain some level of credibility for negotiating this convention and not getting excoriated by other high-ranking officers in the Continental Army, as well as the press and folks back home. But what happens in this time period that you're discussing, November, December of 1777, is that everybody's kind of feeling out this situation. And Burgoyne is really not happy with it. A lot of the officers that are bound by this convention on the British and German side are really not happy with the conditions in Boston, as you mentioned, are terrible. The condition in Cambridge is terrible. Once they first get there, nobody is prepared for this level of, and for lack of a better word, again, not prisoners, because the convention's very clear. They are not considered to be prisoners, if anything, conventioners. So what Congress does next, and the handling of this, is some of the early federal government's political maneuvering at its finest. Burgoyne has this outburst, if you will, in December of 1777 about some of those lodging conditions in Boston and in Cambridge in regards to the quarters as it's applied to rank. That, the higher up the rank you are, the better the condition of the quarters you'll be afforded. And Burgoyne has absolutely just had it by December, and he has this public outburst, if you will. He writes a charge that the Americans have violated the terms of the convention based upon this scenario. What Congress does is they use this as an excuse in January of 1778 to suspend the execution of the convention. That everything that had been negotiated by Gates and Burgoyne is now put on hold. And this is going to allow the Continental Congress more time to begin to deal with the court of Great Britain and figure out the next steps of what are we going to do with these 5,000 men that are inadequately housed in Cambridge and Boston. How are we going to feed them, clothe them? All of these things that Congress needs to work out and see what parts of the convention is going to be beneficial to the American cause, and what part of the convention can the Americans politically outmaneuver to benefit again the American cause of the war now in the winter of 1778.
Perfect. And just taking a step back, we had a few questions come in. Did
Sure.
Gates consult his senior officers, Morgan, Arnold, etc., if they would support a convention agreement? Well, Arnold's wounded. His second command, Benjamin Lincoln, I think, is also slightly wounded. Morgan's just too far down. He's one of the colonel, I think, at the time. Don't know if he got his brigadier generalship just yet, but he does. They're too far down the totem pole. Some of the most, depending on how much you believe of Wilkinson's accounts, it seems like Gates is, at one of the times when they're passing messages back, Gates even pulls out a piece of paper out of his pocket or so forth and says, I already have some terms agreed upon. So it's probably pretty one-sided on the American side. I don't know
Agreed.
if you agreed. So
yeah, I think he does consult with some of his staff. I know he does consult with Wilkinson. He does consult with his adjutant at the time on his staff. But other than that, the high level officers within Gates's command are really either unaccessible. Again, Gates is on a time crunch. He's got to get this done within a matter of days to allow him to not only get Burgoyne's army out of the area, but to get his army prepared to meet the threat of Clinton coming along the Hudson. So, in answer to that question on the chat, yes, Gates is pretty much excluding his high-ranking officers. This is not what we would call a council of war, where Gates is widely sharing the details he's discussing with Burgoyne. It is mainly a Gates-sided show in the negotiations.
And then the other question we got is were there any American loyalists with Burgoynes Army were allowed to go to Canada under the convention? Prior to even the convention being established, Burgoyne will try to get some of the Canadian loyalists out of camp and taking some supplies north, try to get them at least to Ticonderoga, which is still under British control at the time. Of course, that'll be given kind of back up as word arrives that Burgoynes Army has capitulated in New York. So there's also obviously some of the leading loyalists in New York at the time. Philip he kind of filters away as well. And so most of them, Burgoyne is actually kind of contemplating what some of the reaction would be up to if these loyalists are caught, how they would be treated in this convention. And so prior to the convention happening, a lot of them will be told to kind of get out of camp. Here's some supplies. Some things believe that some of the maybe some of the money or so forth that goes north. And that's another segue with the money as well, with the pay for things. The Americans, of course, are going to consist on specie, hard currency, obviously because of the depreciation of the continental dollar as the war progresses. One of the interesting facts as well is that it actually behooves, as the convention army is in Cambridge, there are some interactions, of course, negative with some of the colonial soldiers that are there, some of the militia. Some of these militiamen are as young as 14, 15 years old that are guarding these British prisoners. A lot of these prisoners, there's amazing accounts. There's an older book, bringing out data a little bit, Escape in America. I don't know if you can see it, the British Convention, Prisoners 77 to 83 by a guy named Richard Sampson. He has did a great job of finding individual accounts for some of these soldiers that try to make it to New York. And so a lot of them are farmed out. They get hired by local farmers, but there's also a need for some of the keep them there, obviously, because Burgoyne, Phillips, and other ones are concerned about that the more that escape, the more they get out, the less that it'll hold the convention terms as it's debated by the Continental Congress and of course by the British administration. But these soldiers, the other thing is that these soldiers are, a lot of these junior officers, or I'm sorry, the colonels of the regiment are paid or have to put a lot of money and time in training these soldiers, and now they're leaving. Obviously Clinton and all of them are eager to get these trained soldiers if they want to escape, to try to get them there. And Clinton actually will say when he becomes commander-in-chief that they will provide, I think, 1 shilling, I think it is, per soldier that arrives from the convention army back to their original regiment, and that way will kind of supply or kind of unruffle the feathers of these men escaping from their junior officers, from their company commanders, that took a lot of time and money to invest in these soldiers, from the recruitment all the way through the training and so forth. So it's kind of a interesting perspective that they don't want them to escape because it actually hurts the bottom line.
And it's really interesting. Some of the points that you raised there, Phil, was talking about these men drawing pay from somewhere, and the camp followers, and the necessity of these men having specie. One of the things that is often overlooked is the numbers of camp followers, particularly with Burgoynes Army. A number of your junior grade officers, even up through, some of your higher ranking officers, brought their whole families with them. They've got their wife and 2, 3, 4 kids with them, in addition to any other folks that may be, under their employ while, they're in the Army and in the United States, or in the colonies, I should say. So, this is a problem for these guys. And as things begin to shake out during this time period, particularly at least the German soldiers, they're going to be able to draw pay on a regular basis. The British government will continue to pay for their soldiers, their pay eventually, as well as the British will be supplying them food from British supplies that are within the colonies already. But these are things that we'll only see towards the beginning of this convention. As the convention wears on and on and on, and the Continental Congress continues to delay, we're going to see the burdens from the conventioners be placed onto the Americans. But we'll get to that in a little bit. What I want to do is kind of transition us now to kind of the next phase of this, which is the summer of 1778. So these guys are just shy.
Before you phase this real quick, we had a question come in, and I want to kind of clarify. It was, why did Gates believe that Howe was coming north? It wasn't. Gates did not believe Howe was coming north. Sir Henry Clinton, I think, had approximately 3,000 soldiers. He made an expedition up the Hudson, attacking, I think, Stony Point for Planks Point, or if I'm saying that right, which along the Hudson. And so then did not realize that he did not have the manpower to continue up. He could either go back to New York City and hold. So Clinton is very frustrated at Howe, who took the majority of the troops around for the Philadelphia campaign of 1777. But Gates is getting word, and there are messengers that are leaving Burgoynes Army to try to find Clinton and see where the progress is. And so it is Sir Henry Clinton and a small British force that small campaign up the Hudson River. And so that is what Gates is receiving word of, that there is something coming, kind of literally right up behind his lines, and could, as Dan Welch said earlier, pincer him there as well. Yep. And so, let's, but with that, we will transition back into the summer of the first summer of the Convention Army's odyssey in North America.
So one of the things back in January of 1778, the Continental Congress basically puts a pause on this whole thing. And one of their conditions was that this thing needed to be approved by British officials and the British administration. Again, Burgoyne had negotiated this without any sort of clearance from his military superiors within the colonies, let alone Great Britain, Gates does the same thing on the American side. So in the summer of 1778, what will occur is known as the Carlisle Commission. The Carlisle Commission is a number of British government officials that is sent to the colonies to really treat with the Continental Congress on several matters that have arisen as a result of the war so far. And one of the matters that they want to discuss and treat with is regarding the Convention Army. And they basically come and they say on this topic, we have the power, we have the authority to sign the convention so it can finally be acted upon and we can move forward. But again, Congress does some really expertise in their political maneuvering and basically say, that yes, you may have been given that authority, but we won't recognize it. This thing's got to be, taken over to Great Britain. It's got to be signed over there, approved over there for us to recognize it. And what they are doing at this point is the Continental Congress is continually buying time. They're looking for any way to buy time to figure out what to do with these conventioners and how to get out of this thing that Gates has negotiated. So after the Carlisle Commission in the summer of 1778, that'll break down on the matter of the Saratoga veterans. They won't make any real progress with the Continental Congress at that time. And you can imagine when the Carlisle Commission gets back to Great Britain, word gets back to them that they've basically been rebuffed on this matter, that the British government is furious over this whole thing. And this will be the last time that the British government will bring up the topic of the convention and try to negotiate further to get the convention honored. This is it. This is summer of 1778. And so now there's a lot of doubt, worry, concern, if you will, amongst the conventioners of what's going to happen next. And now there's going to be a necessity on the side of the Continental forces and the Congress of what are we going to do with these guys? We can't keep them in Cambridge and Boston forever. So time will march on. Time will march on, and Congress will get around to looking at some of those issues, not until December of 1778. So we're now past the first year since these guys have been captured, when they start talking to representatives from New Jersey, from Pennsylvania, from Virginia in the Continental Congress of perhaps moving these men to those states. But that's going to break down. That's going to break down as well. So, Phil, do you want to pick up the story there and kind of move us into 1779 and where they go from Cambridge?
Sure. So initially, there is some fear, of course, keeping them too close to the eastern seaboard to a port town. I mean, obviously, the British Navy is still very strong. Could something sortie, a naval expedition coming up from maybe Newport, Rhode Island, or, of course, New York City? Because, I mean, these are, at the time, almost 6,000 veteran soldiers. I mean, now, of course, desertions are the ones and so forth, so you might not be at 6,000, but you imagine what another, say, 4,000 soldiers that are very highly trained, skilled veterans of many a field that could provide for the British.
Right. And one of the things we should say, and I don't think we mentioned, is the reason why they are there in Cambridge and Boston is because that was going to be the point of embarkation for these soldiers to head back to England. One of Washington's concerns and why this whole thing gets blown up after Gates negotiates it is Washington fears that those men will be boarded in Boston and sailed along the eastern coast, as you mentioned, to support the British occupation in New York and the British control in that area of the colonies, or further south towards Virginia, towards the southern British armies as well. So that's the reason why they're there.
Or if they go back, say the convention, because there is the ships do arrive to get them out of Boston back to Great Britain as the convention stipulations stay. But Washington's also very acute of thinking, wait a minute, if they leave in October, November, or say December of 1777 and arrive back in Great Britain, they'll replace the troops that possibly are on the manning the islands, Ireland, Great Britain. Those men would get back on ships and arrive back in North America for the next campaigning season of 1778. So the British are just going to, it's like a substitution. And so
Right.
that's why he's worried as well. So they will eventually move him out, I think, out to Rutland, Massachusetts, more into the interior, get him away from, especially as the convention arms break down. Now, men start to desert. They're well, obviously they'll try to arrive back in New York or Newport or maybe even up into Canada, trying to get back to friendly lines. But some of these British soldiers start to realize something else, is that there's enticements, there's recruitment. Officers actually coming to Boston, coming to Rutland to recruit for units in the Continental Army or units in the militia. Even Washington will write a very scathing letter to some officers about how they're ignoring his pleas to stop recruiting these guys, because all they're doing is taking the public stores, and then as soon as they get closer to British lines, they're deserting. He even sends a very strong worded letter to Thaddeus Kuskow, Casimir Pulaski, got the wrong Polish guy there. Pulaski, who's trying to raise a legion. He's like, are you ignoring what I'm trying to tell you? Basically paraphrasing there, Washington. And so you move him out to Rutland. Another thing that plays a part in this as well, as you move them around, everything, they'll start to see that as they move from Massachusetts into more of the middle colonies, the route they take, where they're headed, they're trying to bring them, of course, to maybe some of the more German settled areas of Pennsylvania. There are ties. I mean, some of these German settlements are going to be enticements to these Brunswickers, these Hesse-Hanau soldiers. There's also an interesting that these men, being quote unquote mercenaries of the British are paying for them. And so the more you move them away into the interior, the more you bring them away from possible exchange points, the more it's going to cost the British for them to march back as well. So they will head down. They will settle sometime on land that was actually offered by the Harvey family. Actually, John Harvey in Virginia, outside of Charlottesville, is actually a member of the Continental Congress in 1778. So in November, the southward march begins. There's approximately 1,300 of the former soldiers had decided with their feet to stay in New England, either desert to the countryside where opportunities and relationships had made a stronger appeal. There's still approximately 2,000 British soldiers, about 1,800 German, both Hessian and Brunswickers, and nearly 300 women and children that will take this 700-mile trek to Virginia. During that time, another 600 soldiers actually desert or leave the column on the route. And so now they're heading south through the middle colonies to arrive in the beautiful bucolic foothills outside Charlottesville, where, I don't know, Dan, if you want to take up the story, you can talk about their wonderful abode outside Charlottesville.
Yeah, so as the discussion is, as you mentioned, happening, the Continental Congress of what to do next, where to send these guys next. John Harvey of Virginia, a delegate there, says that they should be housed. Charlottesville would make a great location, just outside of the town of Charlottesville. We can put them there. What Harvey doesn't really allude to is that the land he is referring to is owned by himself. So he's going to make a windfall on this, because one of the things the Convention Army has done wherever it goes is it's putting a lot of, as you mentioned, that specie, hard currency into the local economies. These guys are getting paid. They're allowed to work. Many of these soldiers, both the Germans and the British, are skilled tradesmen. Skilled tradesmen are in high demand in Massachusetts. As the Army marches southward, they're in high demand. So they're getting paid by taking jobs. They're getting paid their soldier pay from the respective, Germans and British are getting paid. So there's a lot of money these guys have, and they're spending money. And Harvey looks at this as a great way to utilize his land, have it housed there just outside of Charlottesville. But there is a little bit of pushback before the Convention Army gets on the march. A number of members of the Continental Congress are still of the idea of Pulaski and Washington that they should not be housing this large force altogether. That these are veteran troops, they should not be allowed. And so there's a number of proposals in Congress that they want to break this army up into 3 spots. Charlottesville will still be on the list, but in addition to that, Frederick, Maryland, where you're coming to us from this evening, and Lancaster, Pennsylvania. But ultimately, that's shut down, and the guys begin to arrive there out of this arduous journey to get them down to Charlottesville. The journey began out of Massachusetts in a staggered way, if you will. This force was divided up into 3 divisions. The first division went 2 days past, second division, third division 2 days after that. But when they get there, what they come across is far worse than anything they had experienced in the New England colonies. Harvey was unable to find those skilled tradesmen. He was under the belief that they would be arriving much later than they did. So they arrived to half-completed barracks. No huts had been done. Some of the barracks still had no roofs on them, although the weather was turning milder in Virginia. There, even though it was the winter time, there was snow that was inside the barracks. So when these guys get there, they're on low supplies. There's nowhere to basically be under shelter, if you will. It is a really bad situation when they first arrive to Charlottesville. But after some hard work and some time, they'll settle in. The conventioners they'll begin to pick up jobs again. They'll begin to work as a skilled tradesman in the area. It becomes, again, a boon for the local Charlottesville economy. Jefferson himself will be hosting many of the top-ranking officers at Monticello, sometimes daily. So he'll form a really good relationship with those officers, including one British officer by the name of Phillips. Phillips and Jefferson had kind of gone way back, if you will, and during this time, Phillips and Jefferson tried to renegotiate the convention, if you will, while they are in Charlottesville. Ultimately, that will fail. But it's going to take some time, but the conventioners will acclimate to their new barracks in just 4 miles outside of Charlottesville near Ivy Creek. But one of the things they will discover, as anybody that has lived in Virginia, our Virginia contingent, Rob Orison and Kevin Pollak and Billy Griffith and Mark Malloy, one of the things that the conventioners will not like is the Virginia summertime heat. And it will be a common complaint in many of the firsthand accounts of the men during their stay in Virginia.
Besides just that, as they arrive there, the barracks that they're supposed to they give you a little description. 24 by 14. There will be
18 men in those.
Yeah, 20 feet long, 14 feet wide, 18 men. Actually, how poor condition these buildings are before they get to a Virginia summer. One of the Brunswickers, Lieutenant August Wilhelm Duroy, left the following observation that the construction is so miserable that it surpasses all that you can imagine in Germany of a very poorly built house. A great number of our men prefer to camp out in the woods where they could protect themselves better against the cold than in the barracks. So give you an idea of how not pleasant these cabins. Rustic would be a step up, I think, in terminology. Yeah. But the officers, we'll spread out. Phillips and Rita Sal and his wife will be entertained in Monticello, Jefferson down the street. Some of these officers find quarters as far away as Staunton or Stanton, depending on if you're from Virginia or not, how you pronounce that town in the lower or the upper Shenandoah Valley. But Jefferson will remark that because of these soldiers coming in, some of Harvey's initial thoughts of a boon to the local economy will happen. I think Jefferson remarks that it's approximately 3,000 or circulating currency in the area increased by 30,000 per week, according to Thomas Jefferson's estimate. Thomas Jefferson never embellished anything, so it's got to be completely right. Got to be right. But you do have this currency mode coming in. And of course, the reason they're there is that Virginia is considered a safer haven. It's farther away. However, that does change. And I know we can spend time talking about them in the campment there, how deplorable the conditions are. But looking at the time, of course, having two historians discuss history, we always start to run a little short. So we got about 15 minutes left. So we'll bring the soldiers kind of back out of Virginia. Right now, initially, obviously, because what happens in 1781, Phillips is exchanged as well. He will go back, of course, to the British Army. Unfortunately, he doesn't make it out of Virginia, out of the Virginia summer of 1781. Dies, I think of typhoid or something in Petersburg, waiting for Cornwallis's army to arrive. And now you have, of course, a British force coming in. You have a gentleman that is well known, infamously in the South, Bannister Tarleton, raids, of course, all the way to Charlottesville. So these soldiers have been moved out of the way, the Convention Army, once again, to keep them from potential, released by the British forces. And so they do move them north, and two of the places they decide to head is actually to Winchester, Virginia. Someone will head out into the lower Shenandoah Valley, and also into Frederick, Maryland, where, as Dan alluded to earlier, I am sitting on the outskirts of Frederick, Maryland today. And before we talk about some of their stay in Frederick, Dan, do you want to finish us up in Virginia?
Yeah, Phil, you touched on one thing I think would be interesting in our listeners, the terms, if you will, the new restrictions placed on the Convention Army outside of what the convention actually says, the terms of the convention, when they reach Virginia, is even less restricted than it was in Boston and Cambridge. Phil, you mentioned that, housing for officers in Charlottesville was scant. Charlottesville is an incredibly small town in the 1770s. There's not enough housing that is according to the rank of an officer. So really good housing. And officers were able to take housing from 100-mile radius from Charlottesville. And one of the things that really puts a craw in many of the citizens of Richmond is the number of British and German officers that are living in Richmond and freely, walking the streets of Richmond, carrying their sidearm and their saber or sword, if you will. And all of these things are going to lead to what you mentioned, between the raid towards Charlottesville, at which point Jefferson is governor. The Convention Army's, some of it's moved to Winchester, some of it keeps going, some of it turns back after the raid. But illness, disease, desertion, all of these events during their time in Albemarle County is coming to take a heavy toll, and the Convention Army begins to break down. As you mentioned earlier, some of the terms of the convention was that these forces would stay together, and the British and German officers would continue to treat their forces as an organized unit and stay together from place to place. But now, as the years have literally dragged on with this thing, we're not seeing that anymore. We begin to see the breakdown of these units. Officers are being exchanged or paroled or released from the Convention Army, and little pockets of these guys are beginning to be sent to other places. They're beginning to be sent to Winchester, Virginia, Frederick, Maryland, some places in New Jersey, Lancaster and York in Pennsylvania. So take us to Frederick, your current domicile, place of broadcast this evening.
So, and I misspoke a little bit. William Phillips is actually exchanged in this late summer of 1780. And so he's actually exchanged for a guy named Benjamin Lincoln. Ironically, Benjamin Lincoln is second in command of the Continental Army that is under Gates there in when they fight the Second Battle of Saratoga on October 7th. Gates, of course, Lincoln becomes the commander of the Continental Army in the South, where he surrenders and does not get afforded the honors of war when he surrenders to Charleston in May of 1780. But William Phillips is exchanged for Benjamin Lincoln later that summer. So Phillips has stuck with the Army, which provides kind of a continuing that command structure, the control and command. Burgoyne, of course, goes back to England. He's actually not seen by King George. King actually tells him to go back to America to be with his troops. Burgoyne ignores it and kind of just hangs out. Never faces a repercussion, but Burgoyne is not there to provide the administration. So it's really Phillips for the British, and when he is exchanged. And so they move these troops up, and some of the Convention Army is housed in what is considered at the time the outskirts of Frederick, Maryland. Frederick at the time, it had provided numerous troops. It was kind of the largest town west of Western Maryland. Obviously, today it is still one of the largest towns outside of Baltimore. And then in the winter, it is the second largest town. In the summer, it falls below Ocean City, Maryland. Apparently, a lot of people like to go to the beach in the summer months. But the barracks obviously is housed there to house American soldiers. But it is reused just like in Cambridge, reused for some of these British and mostly Hessian soldiers that arrived there later in 1780 or in summer of 1781. Today, though, you can now we'll talk about how you can visit where some of these Convention Army's spots are. We had some great comments about how they spent some time in Connecticut. They marched across. Enfield, Connecticut. Thank you, Matt Reardon. Each division spent a night sleeping in barns before they could cross the Connecticut River. A lot of places you'll just see historical markers. In Virginia, you have the Virginia historical markers, the iron signs that have a lot of great wording that is hard to read at 60 miles an hour as you go by. But hmdb.org, type in Convention Army, they will get you to those spots. But you can actually, in Frederick, at certain times of year, go visit the barracks, or the Hessian barracks that are used to house these soldiers today. But do look up when to go, because the barracks does stand on the compound. I'm trying to think of the word. It's the Maryland Deaf School for the Deaf, and it is part of their campus. That's the word I'm looking for, campus in Frederick. But it is still, some of the original is still standing there. So it's one of the tangible efforts as the Convention Army is moved there. And that's where someone will stay until they finally make that march farther north to a small little port called New York City, where they finally, with the rest of the evacuating army, after the Treaty of Paris is signed and agreed, where they eventually evacuate. And so their long odyssey of, as Dan said, of 11 to 13 months, or I'm sorry, 11 of the 13 colonies over 6 years, hundreds of miles, and mostly largely forgotten, even in the history of the historiography of the American Revolution. I have a great quote at the end of this part, so I will, before I do that, I'll pass it over to Dan for any final remarks about the soldiers in Winchester or the ending of the war.
Yeah, I just, for our viewers tonight to really think about that, these guys have been through an incredible ordeal up to 1777. These are veterans of the continent, or excuse me, of the British and German armies, and they've done their part in the war, and then they are just relegated to a back theater, if you will, for the next 6 years. And as you said, it's not until May of 1783 that the Germans are finally released from their internments. May of 1783. And those that are heading back, Germans and British, as you mentioned, will finally make it to New York, New York City, where they will be boarded on ships. From there, their journey has not ended. They're not going to leave for back home. From that port, they're actually going to sail from New York City to Quebec. And it's not until August 1st, 1783, that they will set sail for England. So nearly 6 full years as, essentially prisoners, but known as conventioners. And before I let you wrap it up, one of the two takeaways from our discussion tonight, and really the importance, I think, for more scholarship to be done on the Convention Army, is that, although these guys were not, as I mentioned, technically prisoners, they were, conventioners. When this is all negotiated and begins, it presents Congress with the first prisoner and internment problem, if you will, in the history of the United States, dealing with these guys and what to do with them and how to feed them and how to clothe them and where to house them all together or break them apart. There was no precedent. If you even take a negative view of how Congress, time and time again abuses even the smallest little details of the convention terms to basically, push back the amount of time before they got to figure it out. There was no precedent for any of the delegates in the Continental Congress of how to handle this situation. Troops that were involved in this became really trial and error for the United States, and it will set up how we deal with these issues in the coming challenges, military challenges such as the War of 1812. The last thing that last takeaway, I think, is something that is often not thought about, is that the United States actually is enriched by the Convention Army staying here for 6 years. Approximately 1,500 of the Convention soldiers will voluntarily remain in the United States post August of 1783. They're going to stay for a number of reasons. Number of them like parts of the countryside of the colonies. Many of them will become really ingrained into the economy of the early nation as the colonies form into the United States. Many of them like the niche areas. For example, many of the Germans will stay in Winchester, Virginia, where there's a small German settlement, if you will, there, and York, Pennsylvania, and Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Huge population of Germans living there as well. So, the United States really will benefit from all these 1,500 men of becoming part of a growing economy, having skilled trades, having military experience. The United States really benefits, if you will, at the end of this 6 years, as these 1,500 will stay and integrate. Sadly, however, where the research I think that needs to be done is these men integrate so well into the United States in the post-Revolutionary War period that a lot of their stories are lost. Where do these guys end up? What they do, who they marry. I think the real weight of the research that needs to be done is really to support the theory of how they enrich the United States in the post-war era. So my takeaways of the importance of the Convention Army, I look forward to hearing some of your quotes to wrap it up.
Sure. And so it's almost, Dan, I appreciate you actually nailed two of the three questions that came in near the end. Do you have an idea what percentage of the Hessians never returned across the Atlantic? Obviously, we don't have an exact percentage of Hessians. We know 1,500. So you say 1,500 out of 6,000. So a little, 25% or so, doing roughly math quickly in my head here. There's also, did some of the Convention soldiers stay? Yes, in the United States to become citizens. Ironically, what kind of sparked my interest in this is last June 2021 was headed to Winchester when I was still living in Florida, and just for a history weekend, and decided to get an Airbnb. And then one of the listings said built by a former Hessian soldier who stayed in Winchester, so possibly of the Convention. So the underlying history is always there, and that's what we like as historians, to try to find those connections and clues. We did have some of the Convention soldiers escape, switch sides, and join the Continental Army. Yes, some for nefarious reasons, to get closer to the British line so you could then desert again. Others, obviously, to get out because, like the American soldiers, did the soldiers in Charlottesville, Frederick, Lancaster, and other ones suffer from disease, starvation? Yes, they do have some medical care, but obviously very primitive, and they're also going to be largely, unfortunately, forgotten. I mean, Americans don't have the medical corps and departments to serve their own troops. They're not going to send them there. Obviously, the British need their own medical doctors to keep the men that are actually still fighting.
I'll share one example of that to answer that question. When John Harvey was preparing outside of Charlottesville for the arrival of the troops, he had purchased a large amount of meat to be able to feed these guys. Harvey stored the meat in the ground. So dug a hole, put all the meat rations in there, covered it up. It's wintertime, should keep it cold. When the Convention Army arrives and they dig it up, all the meat is molded and useless. It's all pitched. So and that's a trying situation. I mean, now you got this thousands of men to feed, and there's no meat ration until more can be procured. So yes, 100% issues in food.
So just like the Continental Army or any forces in operating, especially in the southern colonies, meat spoils like that, no matter what time of year. So to wrap it up, I'll use the words of Sir John Fortescue, who is a preeminent British historian who penned the history of the British Army. He said, although there were a few men who purchased comfort at the price of desertion, the majority stuck faithfully to their officers or escaped and made their way to the British Army in New York. Following 1781, the men, by direct infringement of the capitulation, were separated from their officers and vanished to no man knows whither. And so, of course, he's writing with a little bit of bias as a British military officer and historian, but it does show that, yeah, there are actually men that will survive and this ordeal and then march to New York and other places, or try to make it back to the British to continue the fight. So the Convention Army, with that, we will wrap up the Convention Army. We do thank everyone who watched tonight, that commented. Dan Welch, thank you for partnering with me tonight to talk about the Convention Army. In 2 weeks, we will be actually back. I know it's going to be a few days after St. Patrick's Day, but we're going to have an Irish theme. So on March 20th, we will be back for the next Rev War of Revelry. It is the Irish 1798 Rebellion and the Battle of Vinegar Hill. So please join us in 2 weeks. Meanwhile, please continue to check out the blog, emergingrevolutionarywar.org. You might have seen recently that all the I think 63 revelries are now up on podcasts, which however you get your podcast, Apple, Spotify, etc. You can find them. It's enough to drive all the way to California and not need to listen to anything else. All free. In addition to, please continue to head over to emergingrevolutionarywar.org, because in September, we're partnering with Historic Alexandria again for The World Turned Upside Down. That is the international implications of the ramifications of the American Revolution. So tickets are available for that one-day symposium, September 24th. Some great speakers, some from Emerging Revolutionary War and other ones that have expertise in the French or the Russian, or even John Adams and the international sphere. And then November 11th through 13th, if you want to join Emerging Revolutionary War back in the field, we are doing the second annual Emerging Revolutionary War bus tour. We're going to do the formation of the American Army. We're going to look at the campaign that leads to Monmouth, also the winner that won the war at Valley Forge. Tickets, how to secure those tickets, where to find your lodging, and what it all includes is on the blog, www.emergingrevolutionarywar.org. So for Dan Welch, for myself, Philip Greenwalt, we thank you for joining us tonight on Rev War Revelry, and we'll see you back in 2 weeks as we talk about the Irish and the Battle of Vinegar Hill. So have a good night, everyone, and we'll see you next time.